of Farming Systems Committee, which holds the biosecurity portfolio. Our purpose at the VFF is to be the united voice of Victorian farmers as the state's largest farming policy and advocacy body. And that's what tonight is about. Tonight's webinar will allow the elected president to ask Dr. Megan Scott commodity-specific questions around on-farm response to FMD. I'd like to mention the overwhelming support we've had on the ground, including projects like StockSense, which have been hosting workshops in regional and peri-urban areas to better prepare biosecurity and implement the plans on farm. In addition, the staff/elected committees that have worked tirelessly around travelling the state, advocating on behalf of our farmers and taking hundreds, if not thousands of phone calls. A little housekeeping for tonight. Everyone will be muted, of course, and questions can be typed in the Q&A box. We will endeavour to get to them at the end of the original questions. Otherwise, we will take them on notice and every participant will get a compiled Q&A answer at the end. The webinar is being recorded tonight and will be available in the coming days. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Livestock President, Steve Harrison, Pigs President, Tim Kingma, Grains President, Ashley Fraser, and of course, Dairy UDV President, Mark Billing. And of course, Dr. Megan Scott. So without further ado, to kick off tonight, Steve Harrison, off to you.
Thanks, Danyel. Welcome, everybody. Things have been progressing, in a different sort of a way. And I suppose we all talk to a lot of farmers and people in the street. But my first question to Dr. Megan Scott, and thank you again, Megan, for your attendance and input tonight, is with Indonesia and Bali in particular, where are they up to? I mean, they're vaccinating. And again, the hype has sort of come down a notch or two, in the general public. But, the risk is always there now. Now it's on our doorstep and the buffer zone is gone. So where are we placed with our near neighbours?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. So in terms of the latest update on Indonesia, the information I've got at the moment indicates that certainly the disease is still there, obviously. We're looking at cases now being reported around about 511,000 head of FMD infected animals. So it's still a significant number of animals there that are infected. On the good side, though, we're looking at around about 1.8 million doses of FMD vaccine have been already administered, and there's certainly more on the way and progressing. So on that front, from an FMD, certainly in terms of those control measures, it's really promising, and in terms of how they're getting on top of that. In terms of lumpy skin disease, then in that case, there's certainly no further reports coming in at this point in time to indicate that that's got any worse along those lines. So Australia, from our federal counterparts, continue to support them over in Indonesia in terms of providing that technical advice in laboratory systems, but also on the ground sort of vaccine, provision of vaccines and those sorts of things as well. So,
no worries, thanks, Megan. I'll hand over. Thank you. I'll hand over to the next person who's asking a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Megan. For those that don't know me, Tim Kingma, I'm a pig farmer up in north central Victoria. And I guess, Megan, what's on the tip of most of our tongues is, what actually is the process if my farm gets FMD?
So, yeah, it's a really important thing to understand, because I make no bones about it, that first day, I think, for everyone involved is really stressful. And that first 24 hours, as you start to get your head around what's happening on farm, it is really important to have a bit of a picture of what's happening. So once you get that confirmed, you will have had some sort of contact with us in terms of getting the samples and knowing that sample is going in for testing. Once a positive case comes back, obviously you get contacted to let you know that, yes, you've had a positive case. What tends to flow on from that then obviously comes through from quarantine. So we need to quarantine the premises formally. And what you'll start to see is a number of red plates arrive on your place, and the teams of our infected premises operations will start to come onto your property and work with you to determine the best way to approach getting rid of the infection. So usually you'll have a point of contact on farm known as an IP Ops site supervisor, and that person is there to help support you as you go through that process, and to also seek your input in terms of, you know, how many stock have you got on your farm? Where are they located? What facilities and equipment and infrastructure have you got in place that we need to consider when we're looking at effectively what we're doing is, they call it the 3Ds, and it's destruction, disposal, and decontamination. So it's sort of a stepped process that we obviously have to remove the animals, which are our greatest transmission risk. And we'll do that through destruction and disposal. But then it's also about then decontaminating other items to prevent and clean up your property. So that's not done without the consultation of those who own the property as well. So it's really important that we've got your expertise, because you know your farms better than anyone. So anything further you wanted to add to that?
So Megan, I'll go next. What documents do we need to have pre-prepared in case there is an incursion? And I'm not talking about an on-farm incursion, but if we have an incursion into the country, what documents should we have as farmers already prepared?
Yeah, so those sorts of documentation across general are probably things that you're doing already as part of QA programs and as part of your general record keeping. So what we want to know, and some of the questions that you might be asked, is really designed to meet the needs of tracing. So when I talk about that, the records I'm talking about are things like who's come on and off your property and when did they come, and did they have contact with your livestock. Things like your NLIS records are critical so that we know what livestock have moved, and particularly even other products as well. So when we're talking about livestock products, so it might be milk, wool, and those sorts of things that are coming on and off your farm. So the basic record keeping is really useful. The other thing that's good to have on hand is obviously your biosecurity plan. And regardless of where the disease is, if you've got a good handle on what you're doing on your farm to essentially, what I think of it is like quarantine your own farm, even though the disease is somewhere else, it's about how you're protecting your own boundary or your own fence line to protect you from getting your disease. So that's where your biosecurity plan is the other documentation that is really critical. And I tend to think of it that often, you know, business as usual, you'll have a bit of a biosecurity plan in place. But as soon as you hear that there's a detection of disease somewhere else in the country, that's where I'd be wanting to step up those measures. And I saw this, I for better or for worse, I worked in the UK in 2001 in private veterinary practice. And I certainly didn't work on the foot and mouth response, but I worked on farms in areas that didn't have FMD. So it's kind of the scenario you're thinking about. And for those farms, they'd increased that biosecurity by putting out mats on their farm. And I still had to go through that decontamination process, and they were still monitoring who was coming on and off that property, even though the disease wasn't in their particular area. So those sorts of records are really critical.
So you're saying they still needed to go through a decontamination process even though they hadn't had FMD on their farm?
They chose to. That was their choice. And this is a message I really want to get home to everyone. The responsibility to protect a farm, there is so much that you can do regardless of what declared areas are in place or what quarantines are or aren't in place. There are things that you can do on farm to protect yourself from getting the disease spreading or reduce that risk dramatically.
Yep. Very good. Thank you.
Megan, can I just touch on biosecurity plans, please, Stephen? So there's no right or wrong answer, is there, when you fill out your biosecurity plan? In my own case, I take on a lot of adjustment stock. So, yeah, obviously I'll do the NVD all the time. But, yeah, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer when you fill out your biosecurity plan, and they're readily available, aren't they? Like, yeah, there's a host of them out there. Can you just expand on that, please?
Absolutely. To me, the only bad biosecurity plan is one you don't have or one that you don't know how you practically implement. So if you've just pulled something off the net and done a tick box and tick and flick and gone, yep, that's done, I've whacked it in the drawer of the cupboard and never seen it again, then that's useless. So that's a bad biosecurity plan. But if you sit down and you think about the fact that if I was quarantining my place and I wanted to prevent something from getting in, what are the things that I would need to do to protect myself? And so there are things like, where are your gateways? Where are the risk areas that bad fences where stock can cross, rivers, all those sorts of things where breaches on your property, if you're thinking about that fence line as being the area that you can protect. The other thing to be thinking about is that when you're writing a biosecurity plan, it's about being practical. Saying you're going to decon certain things and having this massive decon trailer and all whiz bang, it may not suit you. You may just say, yep, my decon plan is at the front gate. I'm going to have a gurney there and bund it with a bit of old hessian or a few hay bales or something to stop it from flowing into the drain next door. And things like that. So make it practical, make it work for your property, because everybody is going to be different. And where probably those areas of most risk are. So you'll know what contractors come onto your place or where your stock move, and thinking about what laneways you could use or what paddocks you could use if an FMD outbreak was here, how you can move your stock around your own farms to try and protect them. So it's just, there is no bad biosecurity plan other than the one you can't practically implement.
Thank you.
Megan, I might go next. So thank you again for your time this evening. But I think for a lot of dairy farmers, the main concern we have is, will our milk be collected if we're in an exclusion zone, and even outside of the sort of the epicentre, what's the process going to be there? Will our milk be collected?
Yeah, so milk's the dairy industry is certainly one that is obviously, we don't have time to sit back and think over a couple of weeks to make a decision. So this is certainly really topical. Now, in the case of a livestock standstill, which is that initial, in the first instance, that's the first thing that will be called in an outbreak, which means that all live animal movements stop. There are provisions within that to allow for dairy animals to move directly across a road to the milking parlour or the dairy shed. So those sorts of things, we acknowledge the fact that those cows need to still get somewhere to be milked, or else we're going to create a much bigger welfare issue. But it's directly across the road. It's not 3 k's down the road. It's in areas where you've already got those approvals in place anyway. So they're kind of a standard practice. The preference is obviously the least you do about that, the better. So if you can keep them on the same side as the farm after you've moved them across and leave them there. So those sorts of movements are allowed. In terms of the movement of milk, then this obviously, it gets really complex, because we know that milk is moved considerable distances around the state and across borders. So it's a matter then of looking about what sort of properties that milk has come off. Now, if we're talking about properties where we've got confirmed infection, then clearly that's not a risk that we really want to take. So there'll be other arrangements, and we're certainly working, the Ag Department is working very closely with EPA in looking at ways that we can either treat the milk or that we can safely dispose of it. The other thing, if you're looking at properties though that have had no clear infection, they're the low risk properties, then there'll be provisions in place that we can allow those sorts of movements of milk to continue. And there'll be conditions, so permit, you'll need to get a permit to do that. And conditions within those permit will require you to do things like decontaminate the tanker before it comes on and before it comes off. And just things, if you think about the way that this virus can move, one of the ways it moves is through through vehicles and through the clothing and boots and things like that. So they're the sorts of things that get worded into a movement permit, that we want you to control those sorts of things through cleaning and disinfection, so that we can actually manage that risk. Yeah. So there is no 100% guarantee that nothing will move, but these conditions and permits and movement restrictions are all about managing risk. Nothing is 100%.
Yeah. So the other thing that I suppose is a little bit peculiar for dairy in Victoria is that we have 3 distinct zones. Yes. In Gippsland, Southwest, and in the North. So in the case of an outbreak, where would the zonings be? For instance, if there was an outbreak in the Southwest, would that be zoned separately to the other parts of the state or not?
In the initial stages, it's unlikely that that would be the case, because it's all about, and I'll put an epidemiology hat on here, it's all about where things are linked and where they've gone to and where they've come from. So initially, you can expect that in Victoria, we will have a control area that'll be the whole of the state. So there'll be some sort of movement restrictions and permits required to move those sorts of products around. But if we get infection, then the chances are it'll become what we call a restricted area, which is like a hot zone with much more stringent conditions. So we know that given the movements of milk often go between those dairy regions and the movement of contractors and all sorts of other things, it'll be a matter of tracing where those sorts of movements have been and gone before we'd actually decide whether or not one zone or one area could be zoned off from another.
Okay, thanks, Megan.
But yeah, it comes back to those records. I suppose that very first discussion,
Yeah.
What documents do you need? We need those records so that we can do that tracing and that tracking to make those decisions quickly.
So Megan, Stephen back again. The ship's hit the sand. It's I've identified it on my property. I'm FMD trained. Doesn't look good. So all of a sudden I'm a hotspot. My neighbour's 3 k's away, but obviously a neighbour. Can you just explain? Yeah, I'm in the red zone now. How far out? I mean, it's not a circle as such. Yeah, how far do we go to a control zone? And yeah, how can you just explain? Yeah, that please.
Yeah, sure can, because this can get really confusing really quickly. Yeah. And I want you, for just initial points, I want you to think of it like a target, like an archery target. The center is your red hot zone, so what we call a restricted area. The outer bit around that is what we call a control area, which is sort of a buffer that we're trying to, where we don't think we've got infection, but we want to make sure that we've got a bit of a buffer between that and everywhere else that we think might be clean. So every infected property will sit within a restricted area. So that's how we draw the line. So if we've got if it's just your property, then that'll be basically where the line sits in around. Usually they talk about a 3K radius, but sometimes that might be slightly adjusted to deal with things like geography of the land, prevailing weather conditions. There's all sorts of other sort of epidemiological factors. So what we're trying to do is capture all of those properties that are high, what we think could potentially be infected or close to you. So 3Ks is usually used as a guide, but it may be different at the time, depending on looking at all those other risk factors. But essentially, if we have other properties, then it won't just be the 3K or that area around your place. It will start to draw that circle or that area around a much bigger area. I can give you an example. In avian influenza, we had our hot zone. We drew the area around all our infected properties, and then we drew the next zone out. Our control area actually turned out to be the shire boundaries, so it was slightly off centre. It wasn't a perfect area, but again, that was done based on risk of where other properties were and where we thought the risk was. So that's how all that's sort of decided.
So in your experience, again, I'm it. Can I go to the pub, or can my wife go do the grocery shopping, or am I sort of, stuck at home? What's the requirements there, please? Yeah,
I'm not going to hold you to the front gate and leave you at home all day, Steve. What we will ask though is that you decontaminate when you come off. So what we're trying to do is manage that risk of it spreading any further. What I'm really keen on when I get to any of these infected properties, and if I'm the first one on scene, then what I'm looking for is an opportunity to pull a house away from the day-to-day farming. And the idea being that you might have a separate driveway, you might have a separate area that we can use, where a gateway or something that you can come in and out of, that once we've got you clean, it's away from the livestock movement areas, then that house area, you and your family can keep coming and going. So kids can still go on school buses, you can still go down to the pub, someone can get the groceries, all the day-to-day things in life.
No worries, thank you.
Megan, can I just ask, would the exclusion zones be different if the outbreak or the incursion happened during winter as opposed to summer? Because obviously in 2001, when the outbreak was in the UK, that was during the winter, I believe, or going into spring. So does a dusty environment create more of an issue or less of an issue?
It's probably more the wind
Yes,
that we're looking at, rather than the actual time of year or the seasonality of it, so to speak. Those sorts of prevailing winds, because we know that the virus has the capability under the right wind conditions. So if the right wind and humidity are usually what you're looking for, and if the conditions are right, then it can travel quite some distances. We're talking kilometres rather than meters in those sorts of situations. So yeah, normally we don't have a zone that's say 3K for summer and one that's 10K for winter. It doesn't tend to work that way, but those sorts of weather conditions are taken into consideration.
So, Megan, Ash Fraser here. With regards to border towns, so I live in up in the northeast part of Victoria, and it's probably the last comment was probably a good segue into that. Many landowners along the rivers have properties on both sides. How are they affected in that regard?
Yeah, so where we can, we try to get consistency in what New South Wales's rules are and what Victoria's rules are, if that makes sense. And certainly when you look at, and that's the whole point of something along the lines of VFF Plan, which is our guidance document in how we manage a response. So the intent is that we try and have that consistency across the two states. The challenge we've got though is that Victoria works under one legislation and New South Wales works under a different legislation. So what you might find is that the property on the New South Wales side will be managed under a different act, and the paperwork and all those sorts of things might look a little different compared to say we in Victoria, we'd issue a quarantine notice and that will be done under our Livestock Disease Control Act. So that you will notice there will be some subtle differences. The challenge will be in how, we won't stop you moving between properties, but the movement of livestock across that border may become an issue.
Yeah, okay.
So Megan, my question, like feral pigs and other feral animals that can spread FMD as well, what's going to happen once we get in these restricted areas and to take care of, feral animals?
Yep, absolutely. So part of the risk assessment whenever we get any of these cases is what else is out there other than the farm that we know that might be infected. And in those sorts of situations, that's where we start to say, well, what surveillance have we done and have we got or can we do in terms of things like feral species? So the first thing I'd be looking at is there'll be some sort of indication to suggest, well, have we got feral species in that area? If we have, then what sort of information can we get to determine whether or not they may or may not be infected? So that kind of then dictates as to whether or not you go ahead and do any sort of control measures sitting within those feral populations. There's always a risk. Some of the international evidence is suggesting that feral animals through some of the European outbreaks haven't tended to be the source of infection for commercial farms. Now, we've got to accept that that's certainly a situation in Europe. It doesn't mean that that will be exactly how it will behave in Australia. And we acknowledge that certainly up in some of the areas of the north, that you do get quite an interaction between ferals and domestic commercial species. So the challenge we've got is that we've got to find out, A, are they involved? And B, if they are, then we look at different methods. The other risk that happens is sometimes when you start to implement some of these control measures on feral populations, you can actually increase the risk of dispersing the disease. So, if you shoot out one area, the risk is that the ones that remain will actually move into new areas, and then suddenly you've got a much bigger infected area. So lots of different things have to be taken into consideration, and certainly some of the work that we're doing in our planning at the moment is looking at different ways that we can either remove feral species from an area without dispersing populations, but also sort of assessing how we manage that risk.
Yeah, Megan, you've mentioned permits a couple of times. I'm just wondering what will the process be? What will it look like, and what can farms do to be permit ready, I suppose, so that what can we do now to make sure that we've got the information we need to get a permit?
Absolutely. So the holy grail would be a national permitting system that everybody across Australia could log on to and gain their permit. We're not there yet, and we're probably some way off that. What we have got though is some really neat guidance in terms of what you're asking, in terms of what are those conditions that I have to meet for you to even look at me for a permit in terms of moving animals or product. So those sorts of things are currently listed in AusVet Plan. And I know we've recently reviewed AusVet Plan, literally this week. The writing group has get to provide the last comments, and there's been some hotly debated topics in those movement tables because we want to be able to allow things to move, but do it safely. And the intent, and the importance of that comes into those conditions. So some of the things that are commonly linked into conditions in the movement permits are things like decontaminate the vehicle on and off the farm. But, these are a bit of common sense. We're not trying to ask for something too unreasonable. It might be that you travel along an approved route. Now, some of this is happening in the industry already in terms of what paths and tracks can happen. Some of it's about record keeping, know what's going, what's happening. Some of it's about not moving livestock that are showing clinical signs. So someone's stood there and had a look at them before they've loaded them on a truck. So some of those conditions are quite common sense, but we put them in there to make sure that it happens. And therefore it reduces the risk of that movement. Again, nothing is 100%, but we want to try and manage it as best we can.
So I'm guessing, like we saw with COVID, border crossings. So will you need a permit to go into New South Wales and then one to come back? And whether it's movement of livestock or milk or whatever it is, I'm assuming that's going to be a topical discussion as well, because the jurisdictions might be a little bit different in New South Wales and South Australia for us.
Yeah, and that's always a risk in a response. We do all this work in setting up these nationally agreed approaches, but of course you can imagine in a response, there's a whole lot of other political and other sorts of issues that come in on top of that sometimes dictate what a different state will accept or won't accept. So in short, yes, you will need a permit to cross borders. That's if the movement is allowed, and those, but there are opportunities at times if we're looking at things that are constant movements. And I'll use the dairy industry as an example, where you're obviously moving trucks regularly to do milk collections that head across borders. Then there are opportunities where in previous outbreaks, we've issued permits, but given them, you don't have to get a permit every time you move a truck. So the permit might be granted for a 2-week period or a 1-week period, or whatever's deemed appropriate at the time, so that allows for that movement to happen under permit, but you're not actually tied down to the administrative burden of having to do it every single time.
Good. Well, thanks, Megan.
All right.
I'll have a go again. You've spoken again about permits and roadblocks as such. It's going to take a lot of people, isn't it? I mean, VFF Livestock, as soon as you join up, you're like all other peak bodies, you're required to do the basic ILO training. And not everyone put their hand up, but we've got a few trained, same as pigs and dairy, of course. But higher up, how are we going to go for staff? Initially, we just hope it's a small outbreak. How are we going to go?
Resourcing is always a challenge, and I've heard figures bantered around from some of the modelling that they've done, that they're looking at least 1,000 people in the first few days or the first week. So you're right, resourcing is hugely intensive, and particularly those border crossings are one of them. We've had some incredible, we've learned a lot from COVID, good and bad. And certainly our colleagues in VicPol as well, similar sort of learnings. There's a discussion with them at the moment in that police are looking to assist in manning those borders for us in terms of border checkpoints, particularly during a livestock standstill. And I know nationally a similar sort of discussion is happening in that space as well.
And it sort of leads to compensation. I mean, yeah, some of us were involved today. It's pretty intense, isn't it? The compensation. I mean, not everyone can put their hand up to say, yep, I've got it. There's a few restrictions, of course. And yeah, can you just explain compensation, please?
I certainly can. Yeah, and it's been one of those topical issues that causes a lot of angst for a lot of people. And unfortunately, there are a lot of rumours circulating and have circulated in the last few weeks around sort of valuing animals and compensating and what you should and shouldn't be doing at the moment. If I take half a step back, Australia is in the unenviable position that we have a thing called the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, or you'll hear it banded around as EADRA. Now, we're pretty much the envy of the world because a lot of our colleagues internationally look at it and go, this is amazing. And what it is it's a cost sharing agreement between industry and government that during an outbreak, then will cost share a declared outbreak. Now, what that does for you as a producer sitting at home, it gives you some level of assurance that if we get something like foot and mouth disease, then both industry and government have committed to providing you with some level of compensation. And I think for me as a producer, I know with my producer hat on, I know that that's incredibly reassuring. Now, the other thing that we've got up our sleeve is that under the Livestock Disease Control Act in Victoria, there are also provisions for compensation as well. So that sits there as well. The value, I don't know, value of animals comes in and is a bit of a prickly topic at times. You don't have to get your animals valued now to be compensated later. What happens is that at the time you're deemed infected, then we will get a valuer in. So I don't make that call. That's not my area of expertise. We get someone in who knows the business of valuing livestock, and they make that decision. And that decision is usually made at the time an outbreak's declared. So this worry about, if I'm 6 months into an outbreak, stock are worth nothing, therefore my compensation will be nothing. That's not the intent of what we're looking to compensate for.
Thank you. Great answer.
Yeah.
No, it is. Very good. Very good.
Thanks, Steve. Megan, with regards to grain farmers and so forth, most grain farmers have got some livestock on their farm. What happens in the case of we get an outbreak in stock on, say, our farm? What happens? Is there any impact then to the grain and movement, especially if we're coming into harvest or we're heading into our sowing periods?
Yeah, it's a worrying time, isn't it? The part of this is about looking at where your stock and your grain might have crossed over. So if your grain paddocks or your cereal paddocks are out blocks and your stock haven't been on them for weeks or months, and obviously that might be the situation if you're getting close to harvest, then those sorts of blocks can be looked at separately, but they're incredibly low risk because essentially the FMD is moving within the animals. So what the challenge starts to come back to is if the animals and the grain or the feed product has actually come in contact with each other, that's where we start to have issues in terms of potential contamination. So the movement of feed trucks and harvesting machinery and all of those sorts of things, it's about managing that risk of the vehicle moving something on and off the property or between outblocks. So you'd be looking at decontaminating, so clean the wheels of the vehicle, the wheel arches, all those sorts of things. And if you've been handling livestock in the morning, whack on a fresh set of clothes, go and do the harvest in the afternoon sort of thing. Or I oversimplify it, but that's kind of the situation. Try and keep the two of them separate.
So if you're in your red zone's been designated as 20 square kilometres, for instance, can we get permits for movement of grain machinery and so forth within? Do we need a permit? Or
if they've come off properties with livestock, and the challenge will be there's assuming that the property is not infected. If the property is infected, then you will certainly need a permit. It might actually be more stringent in terms of the decontamination requirements, but just from the property with no signs of infection, then it's just a matter of decontaminating those vehicles under the permit conditions.
Okay, so I'm taking my grain, I've harvested my grain, and I've gone off to the harvest receival site to deliver. Any issues, you've got obviously at a grain receival site, you've got grain trucks there from all different properties, all lining up in a row. Is there are we required to decontaminate when leaving farm, getting to Receivable or back, even if there's no livestock?
So off the farms, and it will potentially depend upon where the Receivable site is. So if it's sitting in a high risk area, there might be some requirements in that sort of situation because you've got that high risk. But in general, you should be pretty right. Okay. under the current guidelines. It's it probably links into the other question too, if I may, that often I have heard a lot of rumours about, we're not going to be able to deliver feed onto our property and the stock are going to starve and all of this sort of thing. There is no intention to stop the movement of feed trucks. The idea is we just want to manage the risk of those vehicles that could be moving around infected areas or high risk areas from actually moving disease from one farm to the other. So that's where the decontamination comes into it.
Thank you. Megan, we're sort of pretty lucky, although we've paid for it, I must admit, with EID here in Victoria. What happens, if all of a sudden there's an outbreak in Sydney, in the suburbs there, they haven't jumped on board. They're very concerned about following Victoria. And, obviously we lead EID now, and our stock sense team has done a couple of workshops and will continue to do workshops on EID and biosecurity. How do we go? Like, all of a sudden, it's in Sydney. What do we do in Victoria? What's the procedure?
So in terms of on farm or for the government?
Both.
Right. All right. So on farm,
chicken or salt?
No. I'll put my producer hat on. On farm, I'm double checking my biosecurity plan. And if I know there's FMD anywhere in Australia, I'm looking at that plan and I'm starting to shut gates and say, okay, let's just see what's going to happen. From a government perspective, then disease detected anywhere has the potential to trigger a national livestock standstill. So that's where we get that minimum 72 hours. And that's a minimum. So that means all live animal movements stop. And the way that's implemented, and this is probably important to understand, because the way it's implemented is it's not under one single federal decision. There's no legislation, but what happens is that every state and every territory put in their own legislation to say all movements of live animals stop. So practically what you might notice on the ground is that Victoria might be super quick at getting ours implemented and signed off. Ours might come in first, but maybe half an hour later or 2 hours later, WA, and then New South Wales, and then the others. But essentially, the intent is that that's a coordinated livestock standstill. So Sydney, that's what's going to be happening from our perspective. Tracing, which is sort of where the EID side of it comes in. We'll be expecting a phone call and an email from our colleagues in New South Wales to tell us where and if there are any movements of stock from that Sydney property into Victoria. From there, that's where we trigger our surveillance teams to start going out to visit or contact those producers that might be impacted by it, might be linked to that trace. And you'll get a phone call to say, hey, look, we're just checking in. You've been linked to a case. How are your livestock is our first question. Have you noticed any signs? And to be honest, the first signs you might see out in the paddock practically might just be a couple of drooling animals or some lame animals. It won't necessarily, we see these beautiful images of, I say beautiful because it's a vet thing, I'm sorry, these horrible images of cows with blisters and ulcers and tongues peeling off and all sorts of horrendous things. But the reality is you probably won't see that. That won't be the first thing you see. So, but that will be the question you'll get asked. How are your animals? Are they healthy? Are they showing any signs of foot and mouth? So that will probably be the phone call that you don't want. But you may well have probably heard on the news already that there's something happening in Sydney, and you may well already be a little bit suspicious if you've recently sent or received stock from that area.
No worries, thank you. So the best case scenario is WA gets it and we can just close the border on the Nulla board, but I'm sure they're saying the same to us. So yeah, that's anyway.
I'll let you answer that one, Steve.
That's all right. I think TK might be next.
Thanks.
Hey, Megan, we've just came through Japanese encephalitis, and I guess one of the struggles that we had as farmers was actually getting test results back in what I guess we felt was a timely manner. Yep. How do you think we're set to be able to test, like if FMD is going across so many different properties and commodities, how do you think we'll cope with all the testing?
Yeah, massive challenge. And I think probably just to put some context in that, the challenge we have with Japanese encephalitis is that at that stage, our state labs weren't geared up very early on to do testing for Japanese encephalitis. It all had to be run through the national laboratory at Geelong. As that response went on, the state labs got capacity to start doing the testing, and that meant the results could actually be turned around a lot faster. Our state labs, that has been one of the triggers that they've really been worked hard on in terms of getting that capacity, that if they had to quickly ramp up and do foot and mouth disease testing at the Victorian State Lab, then we could do that. I don't pretend to think, though, that we're going to have thousands potentially of samples going through at a time. So there will be a huge demand on getting lab results back really quickly. One of the things that we have been looking really closely at here in Victoria, and in some ways we are leading the way, dare I say, is point of care testing. And we've had a lot of experience of this in COVID with our rat tests. And look, pros and cons. Some rat tests have given us a lot of freedom and a lot of capacity to do things, but also when you're doing testing out in the field and not in an approved laboratory, you are prone to more errors. Now, but one of the things we've been looking at is a situation where we could actually do some of this point of care testing out in the field as a screening test. So the official samples would still have to go through to the laboratories to get confirmed, but what it could provide us with is some of that early information to both the producer and to ourselves to guide us in thinking, you know, is this animal I'm looking at or this test I'm running actually a positive foot and mouth disease case? What's the likelihood? So that would streamline some of that angst. It won't give you a final result, but what it would give you is a preliminary result to help guide your thinking.
Megan, I might move to around genetics and stud breeders, those situations. So we're at the moment, we're in the middle of our AI program. So I'm assuming that a permitted person would be able to come in, or if our property was permitted to have an AI technician come in. That's the first part. Second part is that if we were in the red zone, does semen that we hold here in the tank become an issue? Can it go off farm? Does it have to be destroyed? There's a fair bit of money sitting there at the moment, I can tell you.
And I'm no doubt some pretty valuable genetics too that you don't want to lose. So some of that decision is based on when that semen was collected. So if it was collected outside of the tracing window, what we mean by a tracing window is it's a period of time that we think disease could have been circulating in an area. So what we do is when we're looking to, if you collected that semen at a time when we don't think we're quite confident there was no foot and mouth in Victoria, then that semen won't necessarily have to be destroyed. So that's good news. If it was collected though in that window where we think, well, these animals could have been infected at the time that semen was collected, then potentially it may need to be destroyed. But some of that will also depend if you're an infected premises, so you already had infection that we know about on your farm, or if you're just a property outside and we're not worried about it. So,
yeah. So I suppose the first part of the question I should have asked was, can the virus be transmitted through semen?
Yes.
It can. Yes. Okay. And
Yep.
I assume that'll be a similar situation with Ella's disease.
Good question. I'd have to double check.
Okay, that's all right.
Sorry.
We've stumped you on one tonight. So you've done pretty well.
I've got
this
my
one.
head in FMD for the last few weeks. I've kind of I've got someone else dealing with the lumpy skin. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning that comes up too when you're talking semen is embryos. And
Yes.
Embryos are actually much lower risk. And that's because when an embryo is treated appropriately, under the normal mechanisms that they do with embryos, then it's actually quite low risk. So
Okay.
embryos are slightly lower risk than what semen is.
Yeah. So if a farming business decided to protect their genetic merit or their genetic stock, and they collected on farm, that if they collected within the window, there would be an issue for that embryo going off farm, though, wouldn't there?
If they're in an infected place, absolutely.
Yeah.
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 Because we
But
couldn't be sure if it had come out of a cow that might have been carrying the virus.
Correct. So if you collected it, say now, and then took it off farm for storage elsewhere, that would be okay for later on if you were trying to reinvigorate your herd or whatever's left after an incursion.
It's smart thinking when you and I have heard of quite a lot of people considering this at the moment in terms of collecting and storing genetic material now. As a bit of an insurance policy, and it's probably not just FMD that's good for. You know, if you think about floods and fires and all sorts of things that happen all the time. Goodness knows, I think I lost about half a dozen stud cows a few years back on lightning.
Yes.
So you lose all those genetics just by natural disasters too. So collecting and storing semen, as one example, is a really good way to do that.
Thanks, Megan.
Megan Ashback again. With regards to notifications, how will we be notified that we're in a restricted zone? And is there going to be a website, etc., where anyone can look up where the restricted zones are, etc.?
Great question, Ash. Thank you. Really, I think it's really important to acknowledge up front that there is every chance every producer in Victoria will not get a personal phone call to say, guess what, you're sitting in a restricted zone or you're sitting in a control area. And I think of it a bit like the CFA motto that we've finally got to a point in the fire world where people no longer expect a fire truck to be sitting at their front gate every bushfire we have. So what I want you to think about is logically you have to be a little bit proactive in this space. No doubt you will hear, whether it be through radio, whether it be through social media links, the emergency app for Victoria that we've got that, you know, normally you get a bit of a bushfire alert, those sorts of things we've got access to that we can actually use to send out alerts. And then the intention will be, if you want more information, you head back to the Agriculture Victoria website. Now, we will have a site set up in the Venom and FMD outbreak, and then that will have all those sorts of information that you're going to need. So it'll definitely have, when a restricted area and a control area has been signed off, it'll have maps there showing you where those areas are so that you can actually get a really good feel for, am I in or out of that particular zone, and what does that mean for me? So those sorts of pieces of information will certainly be available. I really stress use misinformation during any sort of outbreak, and even we've seen it happen in the last few weeks. In the last couple of months with the FMD incident in Indonesia, the amount of misinformation that does get circulated is really quite frightening, and it creates a lot of angst and unnecessary anxiety out there. So we talk about a single source of truth, and you have to come back to the point that go to your trusted industry websites, go to your trusted agricultural Victoria sites. They're the ones that you want to be getting information from, or you at least want to be linking back into those to get the information that you're going to need.
So my follow-up question for that will be for you. With Ag Victoria, is Ag Victoria have the resources? Because we saw with COVID, you could ring service. You were told to ring Services Victoria for up-to-date information, but trying to get through to Services Victoria to get anyone that could tell you any information was extraordinarily difficult. And when you can't get the information, that leads to people making up the information and the misinformation. So have we learned those lessons?
think we've definitely learnt the lessons. I think it's always a challenge about how you implement what you need and the right need at the time. What we have got in place, and I think this is where websites are really quite good, because go there first. We've spent a power of effort lately doing frequently asked questions, so they will be available at the time. And the idea is that your question probably already sits within there. So I think it may take a little bit of effort to have to go onto a site and find the bit you want, but it does actually reduce that pressure that you're putting on other systems like phone systems and those sorts of things. But certainly our customer call centre will have a list of frequently asked questions ready to answer those. Will it mean that you'll get straight through every time first time? Maybe not. You might have to wait at different times. It's hard to know what that demand will be at the time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Megan, Danyel here. Just a couple last questions from the floor and then we will wrap it up. So people that we have probably little control over, such as if you have leased laneways, water frontages, whether you've got solar farms on your property, even power lines and power core, like all these people we have probably little control over. What happens to that? And if there is an incursion, do we have some kind of protection from the likes of a power core person coming on and then going to the next property?
Yep. So certainly if you're, let's say worst case scenario, if you're an infected premise and that place is placed and that property is under quarantine, then any of those services cannot enter. That is a given. If you are not an infected property, you're not currently under any sort of quarantine as such, it will depend a little bit on if you're sitting within a restricted or a control area, because we still want to encourage people to be looking at that just a general biosecurity. And certainly some of that conversation is happening now. And I do know, and I would be quite confident that in an emergency, we sit, or AVET sits and will lead discussions with other agencies. So some of those will be power call, all of the telecoms and all those sorts of water boards, all those sorts of places that are likely to be exactly the people you're referring to. So that conversation at the state level will be had to say, if you are having people coming onto these, and we expect them to have some level of biosecurity as they come on and off those areas. And so that's a conversation that would be had at the time, and there would be an expectation so that gets filtered down to those people on the ground.
And final question for you. In early July, FMD risk to enter in 5 years was around that 11.8 or 12%. Has the risk increased or decreased since then? Where are we at?
Yep. So from memory, I can't remember the exact figures off, but I think it's sitting up a little bit higher than that at the moment. Just because of that ongoing threat sitting in Indonesia. I think it's important to put a bit of a qualifier, or dare I say a disclaimer on those sorts of percentages and figures. It doesn't mean what they are as an estimate. And we talk about modelling as being a guess, or best, an educated guess as to what might happen in the next 5 years, or what likelihood that will be. Those figures that you're hearing being batted around are a likelihood of what may happen based on modelling. Now, it's like saying that every disease reads a textbook and everything's going to present exactly as it should in the perfect model. Now, we don't know. All we do know, and I wouldn't get too hung up on the figures, is that the reality is that we have FMD in a country that is not too far away. FMD has been in a lot of countries globally, and I think the reality is this has just been a trigger for us to sit back and go, what is it that we're doing? Because I think personally we've got a little slack since 2001 in the UK. And that was a big wake-up call for a lot of us. I mean, we have a huge amount of visitors from places like Africa, China, India. All of these places have foot and mouth disease, and they always have had them. So I think what Bali and if nothing else, what Indonesia tells us, it's a reminder of how fragile our agricultural system can be in Australia, and that it's up to us as individuals to look at how we manage our own properties and our own biosecurity to try and protect that what is incredibly valuable industry for all of us.
Thank you. So as we've heard tonight, biosecurity is just a huge shared responsibility from government, farming organisations, stakeholders, and all the farmers. We all have a role and responsibility to protect our borders, land, and agriculture overall. So we, as the VFF, act as the conduit between farmers, government, and we thank the farmers who continuously support the VFF. This support allows us to continue the advocacy efforts so crucial to biosecurity and its funding for all Vic farmers. Our staff and committees have been doing a tremendous job and the tremendous amount of work, and we will continue this to ensure biosecurity is a priority for all. So we please note for all of our members to reach out if they do require anything. And on behalf of AgVic and the VFF, we just want to say thank you, Mark, Megan, Steve, Ash, Tim, Leanne, for being on tonight, and to all the amazing staff behind the scenes, Del, Terry, Molly, Danyel, and so many other people who have assisted us in getting tonight's webinar up and running. So thank you very much. And I am so impressed that we are actually going to close this on 8 o'clock on the dot, because I'm a bit of a stickler for time. So thank you very much to everyone, and please reach out to the VFF, not tonight, tomorrow morning again, and we'll be able to assist. So thank you.